university programs in this university, which actually did not take place in summer but autumn or early winter, both in science departments and in history. In history, we had annual set of 4 lectures that we are having today. And unfortunately, after his death, the summer university program could not continue. And we therefore decided, the Aligarh Historical Society, that we would have the same program, continue to have the same program as far as lecture on the national movement are concerned, and name this program after previously also, I'm happy to say that students at this university took much interest in the program, whether out of history or patriotism, or the fact that there are separate question papers on national movement in the competitive examinations. Whatever the reason, the program was fairly popular, and I am very happy to say I was gratified this time also. The response has been very encouraging. What we do usually is that we have these 4 lectures, and then during these 4 lectures we would announce the date and venue of a test. It will be objective in character based on the points that we have covered in these lectures. And on basis of that, we will issue certificates to those who have done well in the tests. Professor Asad urged on us to be liberal in the issuance of textbooks of the certificates, and within reason we hope to do that. But within reason, not outside. Well, as you entered, you were probably given a copy of the synopsis of the lecture today, and this will continue to be the case in the next 3 lectures. I will generally follow the arrangement of points in the synopsis, but I warn you that I might depart from it also to insert some points which I forgot to include when drafting this. But generally I would follow the synopsis so that you can look at it and see where I am in a particular discussion. Now let me first begin by saying, as a historian, having studied ancient, medieval and modern India, all the 3 periods, that the Indian national movement is perhaps the greatest creation of the Indian people. It had no precursor, either in its sweep or in the change of thought and ideas that it brought about, or in the mass mobilization that take place under it. There is nothing compared to it in any previous period of history. So we have to look at it, both as students of history and of course as a citizen of independent India today, how it came about, and also what were its limitations. When we consider the achievements of a particular movement, we also must consider its limitations. So both points must be handled carefully and accurately when we discuss the history of this movement. Now, there has been much debate about India as a country and as a nation. Recently, there have been 2 publications, both by brothers, one by Benedict Anderson, Imagined Communities, in which he argued that the nation is an artificial construct. It is merely imaginary. There is nothing really substantive. It brings about various people in any particular area together. And it is the result merely of print culture. Printing has meant that if you have a particular idea, you can circulate it, you can propagate it, so that many millions believe in it, although there is no substance. His elder brother, who is a historian and has a particular position or status as a historical analyst, Harry Anderson, P-E-R-R-Y Anderson, Harry Anderson, in a recent book called The Indian Ideology, which should have been rather called Indian Illusion. In Indian ideology, he argues first that India is really not a country. Far from being a nation, it is not a country. It is the outsiders who have given the name India to it, and it is certainly not a nation. And that the whole freedom movement was an artificiality therefore, and he agrees with the Cambridge School that there was no mass support for the national movement until the elections of 1937, and that Indian independence would have come anyway because of the Japanese invasion. This is an argument. I am not contesting that argument just now because the history of the national movement will show how far he is wrong. But I am bringing to your notice first the idea that India is neither a country nor a nation, and that there is a full artificial about it. Now the first answer was given by Professor Rumila Thapar, in which she said that except a family, everything is imagined. Religion, she said, is imagined. There is nothing, just as a nation is imagined, religion is also a matter of belief and idea. And caste is imagined. People are not really interrelated in the same caste by ancestry. It's all imagined ancestry. So it's imagination. Almost every association, every ideology, every theory is therefore, and its followers who group themselves or political parties are imaginary institutions. So to call it a nation an imaginary institution is not to make nations an exception among human institutions. All human institutions, apart from the biological, direct biological or non-biological relationships, are matters of imagination, matters of mental outlook, matters of theory. So, but apart from that, coming to India itself, and since I have already spoken about it in another meeting, I will be particular or brief here. India as a country was thought of almost 2,500 years ago, when there were those 3 Mahajanpadas, then the Mauryan Empire brought the whole country together, and the name Jambu Dwipa was given to it, then the name Bharata was given to it, and foreigners from the Sindhu river, which was called Hindu in Persian, ancient Persian called it Hind, or Hindustan, which is actually a Persian territorial suffix an. It's not Sanskrit Stan, it is the Persian Stan. The Stan being the territorial suffix like Stan and so on. So Hindu is Hindustan. So this was regarded as a country, perhaps because of its one dominant religion, Hinduism, or because of its caste system, or because of its cultural affinities, or the prevalence of the Sanskrit language, and so on, because of its common social institutions in any way, if both Indians and outsiders regard it as a country, but not as a nation. And here we must look at what a nation means and where the idea of a nation in India as to other countries. Political scientists generally consider a nation to be a stage in the development of a country when its people achieve a particular level of consciousness that they do not only belong to a country, single country, but should also be a separate political unit governed by people from among themselves. That is to say, nation does not automatically mean a democracy. It means, as John Stuart Mill defined it, that you would like to be governed by someone from amongst yourself, be it a king, be a dictator, be a single political party, or be it a democracy. But your own, nobody else governs you in nobody else's interest. Particularly a foreign power doesn't govern you in its own interest. Now, here of course, in converting a country into a nation and building the national consciousness, various elements play a part. Language, but not language. India is a country, nation of so many languages. Switzerland is a nation of about 4 languages. The 4 languages are official languages in Switzerland. There is more to language. Sometimes reason, religion, Ireland and Pakistan, for instance, religious nations, they were brought into existence because of the religious affiliation of the bulk of their populations. They are consciously, religiously constructed nations. And there are also other factors. Sometimes common history, as in the case of India. If you come down to it, just because our history has been common, we have been learned. Therefore, we are a nation. So after some generations, Europe may become a nation of various languages, and the European Union becomes stronger and stronger. Or it may again break up into unit parts, no one can say. But certainly India has its own historical past where people have thought that they belong to the same country as the others, and therefore when the national idea brought in the concept nation applied to the whole country. But essentially, in the coming of the idea of nation, there is the basic notion of national independence. You want to be governed by people from amongst yourselves. That is to say, you want your country or nation to be independent of any other people or persons or country. Now, this notion came with the French Revolution of 1780. Up till now, in all the dynastic wars of Europe, nobody bothered about the boundaries of a country living along national frontiers. Nobody thought Germany should be one country or Italy should be one country. It was in the French Revolution when a slogan of national independence, not only for France but for all other nations, as against the empires of Europe at that time, the Austrian Empire, the Spanish Empire, and the breakup, the division of German states into various parts. All that the French Revolution is thought that they could bring in support for their revolution and for its struggle against the conservative powers of Europe, against Austria, Prussia, and England, Spain, if they could appeal to the people of those countries for national independence. Of course, in order to do so, their entire ideology counted. For the first time, they broke with religion. They were secularists, although the name secular didn't come, but what they declared that the state has nothing to do with any religion, that the atheists, Jews, and Christians, Catholics, and Protestants were all at par. They believed in gender equality, except in the question of franchise for voting. Men and women were made absolutely equal in inheritance, in marriage rights, in right to education. They were all made equal. So these were the new ideas with which they combined national independence. And it was from this time onwards that throughout the world, national revolts began to start, first in what is known as Latin America, in Spain and Portugal. And then the spirit began to come to other colonies, including India. Now, in the French notion, there was also a rejection of race, of black and white. So it was a very, what one would say, massive dose of ideology that radiated from the French Revolution. Their rejection of slavery, their denunciation of slavery, for instance, their outlawing of slavery. And these ideas, in time came to India, and if there is a single man who could be called the father of modern India, that is Raja Ram Mohan Roy, a scholar of Arabic and Persian and Sanskrit and Bengali, later on Latin, Hebrew, what in English is called a polymath. He became open to the ideas that emanated from the French Revolution. And then when there was a revival of the Great French Revolution in 1830, he actually celebrated it. Now, he was asked in 1828 why Indians are not patriotic. And he would think, instead of, he had asked this in this question today with your website, why they are not nationalists. But at that time, the idea of nation had not got around. So the questioner, an Englishwoman, asked him in a letter why she found that the Indians were not patriotic. Ram Mohan Roy's reply to it was that in his view they were not patriotic because they were divided up among castes. They just thought of their caste. They did not think of their country. In other words, the past culture, the past psychology, the past ideas of caste hierarchy were so heavily burdening Indian minds that they could not think of uniting. Characteristically, Ram Mohan Roy didn't think that religious divisions were preventing Indians from uniting. A great friend of mine said that there were personal reasons for it. All the great Hindu zamindars, apart from their Hindu wives, used to have a one Muslim wife, whose children, by them, were always brought up as Muslims. I don't think it was only in Bengal. The Peshwa Baji Rao, who is reputed to have coined the word Hindu Patpat Shahi, which he didn't use, but which is now attributed to him, had, apart from his 3 Hindu wives, a Muslim wife, whose son he for some time wanted to make his successor as Peshwa. So this was quite common in India. And Ram Mohan Roy therefore did not feel that religious communities, different religious communities were at the bar to Indians being patriotic or nationalist. He was once asked, I hope you won't mind this joke, but when we are discussing solid matters, it is better to remember to have some humor also, I hope. Ram Mohan Roy was asked by an Indian that my opposite party is that of an Englishman. So any European lawyer I come, engage in the Calcutta High Court, the judge is also English, he could not plead my case. So I want to engage an Indian lawyer. Ram Mohan Roy said, here is the difficulty. A Hindu lawyer will be clever but dishonest. A Muslim lawyer will be honest but not clever. Not by any means clever. So I can't advise you. To another person who denounced Muslims, he said, you know and I know that in our old age it is our Muslim sons or son who will look after them, not our Hindu sons. So this was a mixed society in the upper class, and often to apply modern ideas of communal differences in this aristocracy is not very valid. But in any case, as time passed, it was not only the Indian division into castes, but also religious communities that would play a divisive role. However, the point I am making is that Ram Mohan Roy's statement makes it clear that without social reform, without the propagation of an ideology against the caste system, it would have been very difficult for a national movement. And as with modern ideas, religious differences grew, which were not present in Ram Mohan Roy's time, with Brahmo Samaj included, Muslims as well as Hindus. But they would grow in time, and therefore a second very important element in the national movement would be how you deal with the religious question and the question of various religious communities for Indian issue. In other words, as we shall see, social reform movement and the movement towards religious toleration or secularism or modern ideas is all combined. Modernism really meant opposition to communal divisions. All this ideological development was also central to the development of the national. In time, we shall discuss this. In other words, from a country to become a nation, India had to traverse a difficult journey. This is the admitted. Country divided into castes, a country with various religions, with the potentiality of religious differences, a country of many languages, to make it into a nation was a difficult task. That is what we will be looking at, how it came about. That would be the question that I shall take up. Now, central to this rise of the national movement, the central to this rise of national consciousness was the fact that we were ruled by a foreign power. But Terry Anderson and Benedict Anderson and the Cambridge School forget that the core issue in the Indian national movement was the issue of independence from colonialism. That is the core issue. And this rule, foreign rule, that was imposed on India by military conquest. By around 1857, the conquest of India was practically complete by the British. States had been subordinated in the northwest British boundaries in Peshawar, approaching what is now called the Durand Line. This country was totally subordinated. Its interests were continually were totally subordinated to Britain. What did it mean? It meant a large number of things for different classes of Indians who could not equally at that time realize it. Britain was exploiting India through two basic means, what the Indian nationalists call the tribute, and in fact Britain himself called it tribute, taking its revenues, taking its assets or products of its assets, for instance, giving large amounts of land areas of land to European planters and their profits going to England, building railways with guaranteed interest at 6%, whatever whereas in England the interest usually was about 3%. So what India could have borrowed at 3%, they were giving at 6%. And so on. This was called their huge salaries which they took abroad, which Indians also had an inkling, even in the rebellion of 1857, the Delhi rebels had an inkling of this kind of tribute. This tribute amounted by various estimates today to 4 to 6% of India's national income. Even if you take it at the lowest figure, 4% of the national income, around 1860s, this would mean that India had practically no savings. Because even as an industrial country, industrializing country like Britain, at that time, the saving rate of about 46%. And a non-industrial agricultural country had a much lower saving rate. So Indian economy had no savings practically. And the tribute was therefore a huge burden on India, which ordinary people didn't see. This you must remember, which ordinary people didn't see, but economists saw. Statesmen in England saw why they were regarding India as a prized possession. And as we shall see, the Indian nationalists not only saw it, but by their propaganda, they popularized the nation to the people who would never have thought that India was paying tribute, because tribute was not something which you could notice. Nobody taking away your money from your pockets. Correct? The second was deindustrialization. That word was used for the first time in 1940 by Indian nationalists, but although a later term, it sums up their second argument against England, that England was, through free trade, creating unemployment and destruction of Indian handicraft industries throughout. In 1800, even after the English industrial liberation, in 1800, India supplied cotton goods to the entire world. In fact, paid tribute to England through export of cotton. 100 years later, in 1900, every 3 yards of cloth used in India came from Britain, when India was exporting very small quantities of cotton cloth to China and countries like in the Middle East. But even that were at risk because of continuous English actions against Indian textile industry. In 1878, the lifting of all duties on English cloth, imported cloth. In 1896, the countervailing excise, that is to say, an extra duty levied on Indian cloth so that it could not compete with English cloth. An unparalleled duty throughout the world. No other country has levied a duty on its own product so that it may not compete with foreign imports. And so on. I would like to go into all these details just now because that would take much time, but these were the two positions, two major, the extent of unemployment caused by this and by the railway construction, where transporters of all sorts, banjaras and others, were totally thrown out of jobs, weavers and spinners. It was by spinning that most poor women, widows and others maintained themselves. They were totally forced into starvation. Weavers who were fairly prosperous community up to the 1830s, and then a Viceroy, William Bentinck, said that the plains of India are whitened by the bones of cotton weavers. So they died starvation or they became village laborers. So this was something which affected millions. And unlike tribute, this was something that millions felt. Now, apart from this, which as Indians learn economics as they educated, they studied statistics, as we shall see, and they realized what was happening in India. And with that, the national movement begins the minority. But there were other issues which often affected middle classes rather than the common people. But they affected. Apart from direct racism, see, my father, when he joined the MBA college, he came here at school, said that it was usual for Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, when he travelled by a train, when he stepped down from the station, he went and thanked the guard for the courtesy provided by the British in allowing him to travel on a train. And my father used to say that this was usual. Indians were expected to go and thank the guard. There were compartments which were marked Europeans only. And when in my childhood I used to go to Missouri, it was used to be pointed out that the Savoy Hotel, which still exists, I believe, had a board in around 1910, Indians and dogs not allowed. So there was a racism which you could not think of today. It affected middle classes. Ordinary Indians are always insulted by their betters, whether they were Indians and whites. But for middle classes, this kind of racism was something new. They could not also enter higher offices. Apart from the time of Cornwallis around 1790, Indians had been removed from all substantial offices. Increasingly, as Persian was replaced by English in judiciary and others, they were also shunted out from judicial office, even small judicial office. As far as the Indian civil service was concerned, in my school days we were told by the nationalists, the nationalist propaganda, that the ICS Indian civil service was neither Indian nor civil nor a service. Because they were the rulers. So they were neither Indians, they were all British, bulk of them were British. They were by no means civil to Indians, and they served no Indians, but only themselves. So this was ICS. Its examination was held in England, and it followed for its examination the syllabus of Oxford and Cambridge universities. Nothing about India, nothing about Indian history. All British, Latin, and so forth. So it was then to ensure that Indians did not enter the service, despite the great words of Queen Victoria, the Charter Act of 1853, and then Queen Victoria's Proclamation 1858, that for her all subjects are equal, Indians and English, but in reality, such was the case. Even in Indian institutions, like the Roorkee Institute for Supervisors, Segregation and Canal Supervisors, the discrimination was clear. Very few Indians were admitted, first English people, then other Europeans, then Anglo-Indians, then Eurasians, and then if seats remained, then Indians. All these grievances, exclusion from service, exclusion from employment, racial insults, were middle class grievances. But I think you will agree that even if they were middle class grievances, they were genuine grievances. They were not artificial grievances, as the Cambridge school makes out. They were real grievances. Given only the English system of laws, the English constitution, the English pretensions, they were real grievances. Then there was the religious issue, which has come to the fore in 1857. Remember that technically the Church of England religion was the official religion of India. Queen Victoria might say that she respects all beliefs, but the fact was that the only religion, the only church supported from Indian revenues, from Indian taxpayers, was the Church of England. And missionary institutions gained considerable support, so that in a sense they controlled Indian education, a large part of Indian school and college education. So the religious issue in 1857 was not a minor one. It was an issue on which Hindus and Muslims could combine. But remember that although greased cartridges and the religious issue was supposed to be the main issue by the English, if you read the documents of the rebels, particularly the Delhi documents, their archives, the Delhi Urdu Akhbar and other proclamations, it's only one of the grievances. It's only one, it's a grievance, but one of the grievances. There are other grievances like employment, like British taking wealth away from India, like they're insulting Indians. And therefore the revolt of 1857 is certainly remarkable in the fact that the sepoys who revolted, you must remember, from the Bengal army, were in majority Brahmins from the infantry. And of about 100,000 who rebelled, the Bengal Bengal army strength of sepoys was about 130,000, the rest were officers, about 12,000 European officers. So the 100,000 who rebelled, almost all were killed to a man. And remember that in bulk they were Brahmins, but they often elected their Muslim fellow sepoys. And you see Sayyid Ahmad Khan has admonished the English in Al-Bab Gawat in Hindustan, in which he said that the English committed a mistake by putting Hindu and Muslim sepoys together in the same regiments and companies. Because in battle, when your life depends on your fellow soldier, Hindus and Muslims became closer to each other and brothers. So they revolted at the same time. If the English had kept the Muslims separate from Hindus, which our founders says, then if the Muslims had revolted, Hindu sepoys would have suppressed the Muslims. And if Hindus had revolted, Muslim sepoys would have suppressed the Hindus. But by putting them together, you had actually brought the two religious communities together by ties of blood, which were much closer than any ties of belief and religion. In fact, the English followed this advice, and after 1857, at least in the Bengal army, the Hindu and Muslim regiments were sharply separated. We will see one instance of that when we come to the Singapore meeting. In the mutiny, in the rebellion, there's all the time a concept of India as a country. When Queen Victoria is replied to by the rebels, unfortunately the reply only exists in its English translation. They point out how the British had suppressed Indian rulers, and they begin with Tipu Sultan and they end with Maharaja Dilip Singh. Then from Karnataka or Mysore to Punjab, the English have destroyed all Indians. So there is a concept of India which is particularly remarkable. Nevertheless, it was suppressed. There were other elements in it, peasant unrest, Jammi Talukdar's fear in Awadh of being dispossessed of their lands, and other interests were there, unemployed artisans. But it was suppressed, as you know, with the greatest cruelty. And its suppression meant that for a long time any criticism of England or English power in India would be practically impossible. It is here, therefore, that the work of the early nationalists, who are often called moderate nationalists, or according to Bipin Chandra, economic nationalists, becomes very important. Their origins were different, both in ideology and in social makeup, from the classes and sections that had risen in the mutiny. These were totally middle-class men brought up on English education and living and working in areas most influenced by European and English education and culture. Bengal, Maharashtra, and Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras. Bombay meaning Pune. These were great centers of English education. And there, the first nationalist voices came. First of all, there is no doubt that English education played an important role in the formation of this nationalism. There was a time when we used to feel that this is insulting our national movement if we think that the regeneration came through English education. But this is prejudice. English education opened Indian minds to science, to economics, to political philosophy, to constitutional principles, which were not present in Indian tradition, Hindu or Muslim or Parsi or any tradition. Gender equality, for instance, national independence, these are not present. So the ideas of our national movement naturally were those which radiated from Europe, especially, as I've said previously, the French Revolution. Where could the idea of gender equality have come to India except from the French Revolution, not even from India? And thus, not only the knowledge of the language English, but also what it contained. That was important. Its transmission to India was important. And therefore, two things became very important for the formation of the Indian nation. One, and I will here take, I will reverse the order in the synopsis. One was the social reform. One must realize that the social reform movement, despite some precedents in the time of Akbar, did not come from internally. Even Ram Mohan Roy, so long as his education was in Persian and Sanskrit in Arabic, was more involved with the question of idol worship and monotheism. He was promoting monotheism against idol worship in Hinduism. And he was also trying to bring Hindus and Muslims together very much in the Mughal tradition. A friend of mine, who probably read Tafat al-Muwahhideen, his first work, that is so difficult because it is almost half in Arabic and half in Persian. And not knowing Arabic, I find it very difficult to understand it, but I've tried. He argues that the Quranic injunction to kill kafirs does not apply to Hindus because Hindus are not kafirs. My friend argued that this is anti-Muslim because he attributes to Quran the injunction to kill kafirs. I said, well, that was what I was also told in theology in Hindu circle. But he obviously is saying it because he wants to argue that Hindus don't come under this injunction since they are monotheists. And he goes to Rig Veda and to Upanishads and says that image worship is therefore wrong. But this was his early interest. Then he was arguing that the missionary attacks on Hindus and Muslims are wrong. It's often forgotten that Ram Mohan Roy was among the first Indians to defend Islam against missionary propaganda because he learned English and he knew what they were saying. He could quote Sadi and Hafiz more than he can. And from this beginning, he began to read English literature, went to Hebrew, went to Latin to answer the missionaries. So his first interests were religious. And then he came across other European ideas, the secular European ideas, the ideas of the French Revolution. And the man changed. He said science should be taught. He opposed the establishment of Hindu College in Calcutta, which is now Presidency University. And so when the Hindu College was founded, one of the rules said that Mr. Ram Mohan Roy cannot become a member of the committee of the Hindu College. So he was so opposed to any religious education being imparted in the name of modern education, and he also opposed the establishment of Hindu College in Banaras. He wrote in Persian as well as Bengali and English, and his title Raja was given to him by Akbar Shah, the Mughal, Mughal. His major ideas were, of course, women's rights to inheritance and against sati, in which he won a singular victory. And therefore, from Ram Mohan Roy starts the social reform movement. Ishwar Chandra Sagar saying that even if all the Shastras were to say that women should not be educated, I would say, and he was a great Pandit, I would say that they must be educated. I am ready to defy all religious injustice. So it is here also, of course, he will be affected by European ideas. Remember that it was in 1794 that the French Revolution made school education compulsory for all children, whether girls or boys. So what Ishwar Chandra Sagar was saying, already 50 years old. And then Keshav Chandra. His name is misspent, either it could be written Chandra, or it should be written Chunder, as he wrote it. The famous orator, but best of all, an uncompromising social reformer. First man to say untouchability should be. First man to say intercaste marriages should be valid. First man to say women should have equal rights with men. We reformed the Brahmo Samaj, formed the new Brahmo Samaj in order to propagate the ideas. And in England in 1870 he argued, and that's a very crucial point that I am of course following, that the more India reforms socially, the more Indian women are equal to men, more and more men. The more untouchability is abolished and intercaste marriages take place. The more religion is put in its own private place, the more India will become a nation. Nation could only be created, he was now developing without quoting Ram Mohan Roy's 1528 statement, which he probably didn't know, that the more India reforms socially, the more it becomes a nation. He was particularly concerned about religious conciliation, and he was the man who brought Kabir to Bengal. And ultimately, as you know, Tagore translated Kabir's Revolt into Bengali. In the West, Ranade took up the cause, and though not as strongly as Keshav Chandra Sen, who died in 1884 just before the formation of the National Congress, Ranade died in 1901. Ranade was more of a political thinker, more of an economist also, very strongly in favor of women's rights, reform, and of course, religious tolerance. His headquarters were at Pune. In a sense, Ranade bridges the gap, bridges the connection, he and W.C. Banerjee in Bengal, the connection between uh, the social reform movement and the national. Because both W.C. Banerjee was the first president of the Indian National Congress, and in his address, he only talked of social reform and the importance of it for Indians. And Ranade was also one of the moderates and also one of the economic critics. The final thing in which the social reform movements and the nationalists, early nationalists were interested in was civil liberty and constitutional representation. No taxation without representation was the British slogan, and they wanted to bring this political motion. I will say for Saksaliya that on this he was also very particular that people should have the freedom to say what they felt. And he got John Stuart Mill's On Liberty translated. And then after his attacks on the Indian National Congress, and he formed the Indian Patriotic Association, which was hardly patriotic, it was very loyalistic, Britain. He formed it. Then there was a resolution in the Indian Patriotic Association that all Congress leaders should be arrested. And this was a very loyalist resolution, but Sayyid Ahmad stood up to oppose it and said, although I hold that whatever the Congress leaders are saying is wrong and mischievous, nevertheless, I will stand for their liberty to say it. They are at liberty to say it, I am at liberty to denounce them. But they shouldn't be arrested. So the idea of civil liberty came from Britain, the idea of constitutional representation, not democracy, just representation, some representation. But finally, what was the most important was the critique of economic critique of British. And I would like to consider the importance of it and pay some tribute in your hearts to those who researched in it and who published bravely the results of their researches showing how Britain was exploiting India. Because, there are those historians who say that they study history from below, or subaltern historians, and they say the elites, that is to say educated people, took no part in their movement. But subalterns, peasants, ordinary workers, would never have known how Britain was exploiting them had not totally middle class people like Dada Bhai Naoroji, G.V. Joshi, Ramesh Chandra Dutt, and Subramaniam Iyer had not worked out the entire frame of Britain's exploitation. Then, of course, you had a large number of books and publications by others, putting them in simple language, Gandhiji in Swaraj, Barkutullah Khan in his pamphlets, in Urdu, and other languages. Then this got spread. But the first steps were taken by by the set of people whom we consider called economic nationalists. At the top was Dada Bhai Naoroji, who from 1872 onwards analyzed British documents, British statistics, and showed how India was being exploited by Britain. They were published earlier, but are most conveniently brought together in his Poverty and Un-British Rule in India. Poverty and Un-British Rule in India. Un-British was a hit on English, because in English to be British means to be moral, to be honest, not to steal. And he was saying that you are being totally un-British. Others, Subramaniam Iyer, aspects of British, economic aspects of British rule in India, 1993. Ramesh Chandra Dutt, Economic History of India, 2 volumes, 1991 and 1993. Ranade, his papers were brought out in 1898 under the title Indian Economics. And when I was a student of BA here in AMU, Economics, we had a whole paper, Indian Economics, giving the same title as had been invented by Ranade. And in this Indian Economics, we learned all about how Britain exploited India. It has now gone. We don't remember now our own history. They calculated how much India was losing in tribute. They calculated how many Indians were losing their livelihood. Dadabhai Nauroji also wrote cases and memoranda against the denial of employment to Indians. And mark you, there are Hindus, Muslims and Parsis all present. He was himself a Parsi who knew Persian and Arabic, wrote English very well. And he was regarded as the founder of the Indian national movement, often called the grand old man of the Indian. Their writings were particularly important before I go on to the formation of the Indian National Congress in its earlier days, because they talked about poverty. That's a remarkable thing. Coming from middle classes, you would have expected they would talk about mill owners. And of course, mill owners were important in our national movement. I will think of it. How those poor people are being targeted by Britain. They can't work their factories and so on. But that's not what they do. Not at all. It is they are the peasants they are concerned. That because of the exploitation of Britain, the peasants are they are indebted. They are starving. Britain is exporting in order to get the tribute. It's exporting grain from India when millions died in 1895, 96 and 1899, 1900. It is about them that they talk. About the weavers and spinners, Gandhi's own ideas, about the spinning women and the cruelty of them, making charkha the symbol of the Indian national movement. It had he had his forebears in Dadabhai Nauroji and Rajsikar. It is these people that they are particularly in mind. And I think this is what is often forgotten, that they are middle class people. And I was just reading that Ranade, when he went to Shimla for a holiday in 1880s, he took with him 25 servants. So they were not middle class, they were almost aristocratic middle class. 25 servants accompanying Pandit Ranade to Shimla. And he talks about peasants and workers and what distress they are in. So you may smile at it, but still, this is very important. Their main concern is with the poor, not with the mill owners. And therefore, almost half of them supported factory legislation when the mill owners demanded that factory legislation, Bombay mill owners, that factory legislation protecting labor conditions should not take place. And therefore, although they were extremely moderate, even as late as 1903, R.C. Dutt wrote in his preface, we don't want English to go, we want the English to govern ourselves properly, with, along with Indians. Indian interests should also be represented in their government. A kind of constitutional coalition between English and the Indian middle classes we were looking at in the constitution. But all the time what they were demanding was that Indian poverty should go. Well, it was in 1885 that the Indian National Congress was formed. And this is, you'll be happy to know, the last section of the lecture today. I want to say, however, something about the formation of the Indian National Congress. Before the Indian National Congress was formed, for various reasons, there were formed what are called associations, and for this, the Cambridge School is responsibly great interest in the earlier associations of Jamidars and so on, as if association forming was something of an exercise which Indians learned through the benign guidance of the British government and because of their sectional interests. I'm not concerned with that. I'm concerned with the fact that with certain incidents occurred which compelled Indians to think that political action was necessary. What major incident was the removal of all protective duties on British cloth from 1878 onwards. In 3 years, all duties were removed. This was opposed by the Bombay mill owners, and it's rather a personal episode because it involves my great-grandfather, Badruddin Tayyabji. Badruddin Tayyabji was himself a barrister. His elder brother, Najmuddin Tayyabji, was the director of a set of textile mills whose owner was a Gujarati. I forget the name. When a meeting had to be held in protest, you had to find a speaker. And neither Minajuddin, a good businessman, nor his employer, who presided at the section, I'm sorry, I just forgot his name. They were speakers. So they brought in Badruddin Tayyabji, being a lawyer. So Badruddin Tayyabji's first speech, political speech, later on he presided at the Indian National Congress session in Madras in 1887. His first political speech was against British free trade, against British removal of all duties on imported goods. So the connection between industry and parts of the national leadership, the future national leadership, was here obvious. One can't dispute it. They were the financiers. They often financed Dadabhai Nauroji, and Cambridge School makes much of it. Dadabhai Nauroji was financed by the very people who were financing the meeting against British cloth, built as a political meeting against imported British cloth. They also financed Dadabhai Nauroji's expenses in London, and the Cambridge School makes much of it. But when they asked Dadabhai Nauroji to support them in their protests against labor legislation. Dadabhai Naoroji, he supported labor legislation. And the financial support of the lawyers and businessmen of Bombay to Dadabhai Naoroji continued. So the fact is that often this financial support was for ideological reasons. This also must be remembered. All Bombay mill owners were not only concerned with their own interests, they had some other ideas also. And somehow or the other, they supported the moderate nationalists and their critique of the British government and were prepared to spend money on it. So I have often argued that Anil Singh, who brings this up, Dadabhai Naoroji being funded by Bombay mill owners, should have at least read what Dadabhai Naoroji was writing. His writing was uninfluenced by his financials. That's also an important point to remember when we remind ourselves of the business contracts of Badruddin Tayyib or Balabari, the great reformer, and others. Then in 1883-84 there was the Ilbert Bill controversy. Ilbert Bill for the first time aimed to make Indians and Europeans equal before the law in the judicial process. People who say that English introduced equality in India should remember the Ilbert Bill controversy. They should remember that no Englishman was ever given either life imprisonment or let alone death sentence for murdering Indians, in whatever number. Not a single, throughout the history of British rule in India, not a single Englishman was sentenced to either long imprisonment or death, even when he wantonly killed Indians. At the most, dismissal from service, fine, or 6 months of prison. Ilbert Bill sought to create a situation where Indian judges could try Europeans. They could not try it before Ilbert Bill. There was such an uproar among Europeans. They even tried to attack Ripon, the Governor General, the Viceroy at that time, so that Ripon's aide-de-camp, who accompanied him all the time, that they are known as Aligarh. The British Englishman drew his pistol and for the first time pointed a pistol against Europeans to keep away from the Viceroy. This was the European operation. Now one would think British government to stand up for this against this hooliganism, but they surrendered. And it was the surrender on the Ilbert Bill issue that created for once again the whole issue of racialism in India. That Europeans would be treated differently from Indians. And A.O. Hume, the civil servant who resigned, now comes into the picture. And he thought that Indians should come together in a political association to give good advice to the British government. At least that is what he said in the book. And he brought Indian statesmen, Indian writers, and those who were speaking politically, people like Surendra Banerjee, Badruddin Tayyib, I have already spoken of. Dadabhai Naoroji was in England. He fought his help. Dadabhai Naoroji presided over at the second session of the Indian National Congress at Calcutta. And so they formed the Indian National Congress. It is totally wrong to say that Dufferin advised Hume to form the Indian National Congress. Hume never claimed it. He simply said, I have discussed the matter with the Viceroy. And actually, Dufferin in his private papers had very strong remarks against Hume. And he advised the governor of Bombay to keep people away from the Indian National Congress. So this was a wrong thing. I think R.P. Dutt has been currency to it among important writers that Dufferin treated Indian National Congress as a safety. Things became clear in 1888 when, after meetings in Calcutta and Madras, it became clear that Congress, far from supporting the British government, was, with the total support of Hume, passing critical resolutions. Hold the civil service examinations in India, withdraw the Arms Act, which was disarming Indians, levy income tax on all Europeans and Indians alike, and so on and so forth. That Dufferin began to ask all officers to oppose the Congress. In 1888, he gave the whole note, a statement, in which he described Congress as a microscopic minority. And for the first time gave the slogan of overpopulation. He had used it. He was a big English landlord in Ireland, and he had said that Irish difficulties also came from overpopulation. And he now applied it to India, that India was overpopulated. One could have asked him, Irish people could migrate to America, where could Indian millions migrate? Even if you agree that India was poor because of overpopulation, what was to be done about it? Could you find a country, as he had found for Ireland, go to America, could he find a country where Indian tens of millions could go? And he was immediately answered by J.V. Joshi, and one admires the pluck of these people. He said, India is not poor because of overpopulation, but because of underproduction, and there is underproduction because the British government doesn't do anything about it, but by free trade is ruining Indian industry. So this was J.V. Joshi's immediate answer. Another nationalist economist of that time. Now, at that time, coming back to Hume, Badruddin Tayyabji, who had presided over the Madras Congress, the next was being held at Allahabad, he wrote to Hume that since the British government is opposed to our Congress, wouldn't it be better to postpone the Allahabad Congress and until the government quietens down. Hume wrote, we did not, and that's very important, and all to his honor, that we did not form the Indian National Congress to please the British government. We formed it to assist the Indian people. And so he was secretary of the Congress. So Badruddin, don't try to get the Allahabad Congress postponed. And the Allahabad Congress was held. Hume printed the Congress manifesto in 12 languages, and despite Sir Sayyid's opposition, he spoke against the Congress in Lucknow, was knighted 3 days later, not for his work on education, but for his opposition to the Congress. Knighted him in 1888, 3 days after his Lucknow speech. Then in Meerut speech, he threatened to use arms against the Congress. We are a military community, the Muslims, and we can, unless the British government satisfies our demands against the Congress, we shall take to arms. Even Times of India said that which was a British paper at that time, was a rather extemporary. But what were the points of opposition? Sir Sayyid's speech gives us the three major points of opposition, which now the British government was encouraging, and which proved to be important. One was that Congress wanted democracy, which the Congress at that time denied. That they would be put low caste men in the same on the same table, at the same table as the great landlords, Thakurs and Raises, brought in Rajputs also, Sayyads and Raises. How can they sit with Darzins and others? So this was the first, and he said that I had opposed when Ripon was getting his measures arranged for local self-government, then I had opposed that. I had asked for nominations. Because if you are voting, you will have low caste people. So this was the upper caste, lower caste thing. If you agree to Congress demands, the lower castes, lower classes will get uppish. And of course the fact that the economic nationalists has spoken of the poor and so on gave an edge to this kind of argument. The second argument was regional. Bengalis and Bombay people, even Muslims who were with the Congress were mainly Bengalis and Muslims and Bombayites. They wanted to dominate the whole of India. They would not be allowed to do so. So there is a lot of diatribe against Bengalis in such a year. The third point was religious. Muslims are not there in the Congress. Those who attended the Allahabad Congress, and somehow 1/3 of the Allahabad Congress delegates were Muslims. Those who attended they did not represent the Muslim gentry, and therefore Muslims must not join the Congress. He did not say that they should form a different organization, but they should not join the Congress, and they should remain loyal to the British government. So these three strings are important because they played a certain role in the development of the Congress or stopping the development of the Congress as we begin to see in 1990s. The Congress then broke up, and I'll be brief now. The Congress broke up into two groups. The moderates who wanted social reform, who wanted constitutional development rather than immediate slogan for self-rule in the Irish fashion. They were led by what was called the Old Guard, Dadabhai Naoroji and others, but they had a very important young leader in Gopal Krishna Gokhale, who particularly became important after 1900. The extremists, or who are known as militant nationalists, were led by Bal Gangadhar Tilak. Gopal Krishna Gokhale here, Bal Gangadhar Tilak. Both were from Maharashtra. Both had totally opposite views. Gokhale didn't believe in Orthodox Hinduism, didn't believe in caste system, believed in concessions to Muslims. Congress passed a resolution that anything unacceptable to a larger number of Muslim delegates will never be passed by the Congress on these concessions. It was said that Gokhale could be elected by any constituency of Muslims. And he was the mentor of Gandhiji. Gandhiji always treated Gokhale as his mentor. Not Tilak, although Gandhiji had great respect for Tilak and everybody should have, but he was not his mentor. Bal Gangadhar Tilak, on the other hand, was in some ways a firebrand. He took up reactionary issues, hostility to the age of consent bill, which only raised the child marriage age from 10 to 12, and Tilak mobilized both Hindus and Muslims against the age of consent bill. Whereas the moderates, Malavari and others, Gokhale supported the age of consent bill. And Tilak also raised the Shivaji cult issue and said that Shivaji was right in stabbing Khan, which British regarded as a condonation of murders of British officers by Indians that they took place. And in 1898 he opposed cholera inoculations because this was set against both Indian and Hindu and Muslim religions. So he brought in religion as a mobilizing factor, which has all the dangerous consequences. Because once you touch Hinduism, even if on some issues Hindus and Muslims could combine, there was all the danger of communalism being propagated. And you could see it in the writings of Aurobindo Ghosh, which became an influence very important after 1905, where he said that there should be, Hinduism should be revived. And the central principle of Hinduism is Shakti, power, not ahimsa, not the Shanti, not peace, but Shakti. And it was this kind of religious nationalism which Tilak's speeches also promoted. I shall come to the acts of terror later on when I discuss tomorrow's lecture, the rise of militant nationalism. So to Tilak, religion and caste, which were anathema to the moderates, became the mean task of mobilization. What appealed to nationalists, however, in Tilak was his forthwith demand for Swaraj, not independence, but Swaraj. Swaraj is my birthright, he told us. And let me end by bringing in our MAO college in. But before I say something else, in 1904 or 5 there is a CID report about a man called Hasrat Mohani. You know Hasrat Mohani? Yes. Poet. So, very colorful line from it. He said he has the picture of Tilak and Gokhale both in his room. And as you would expect, Hasrat Mohani was expelled from it. So, but to someone who had nationalist feelings, both Tilak and Gokhale agreed. Gokhale to his reason, Tilak to his emotions. However, by 1904, the moderates were in decline, partly because the British government was in no mood to give any concessions. Extremists were becoming stronger, and Curzon, who was the viceroy and one of the most unpopular viceroys at the time, and if you are tired, I will, if you, despite the fact you are tired, I will quote a verse from Akbar Allahabadi showing how Curzon was unpopular, because Akbar Allahabadi's pipe extended to Lady Curzon. He said, रॉयल हॉल में बॉल हुआ है, बॉल में नाची लेडी कर्जन छन 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 छन. It was very unfair because in European ball there is no छन छन there. It's all sedate. But Akbar Allahabadi also said against the British government, मैं तो अल्लाह को collector समझा. So when you next say Allah Hafiz, remember you would have said collector. Anyway, as we will see until 1920, Akbar Allahabadi reflects, those verses will come later, reflects the common sentiment, the moderate Congress sentiment of the time. And from this, seeing that this is said by Congress, moderate congressmen about Curzon, you would think how unpopular he was. Now Curzon in 1924 said, famous statement, Congress is tottering towards its fall. He was noting the fact that Congress sessions were getting smaller and smaller. Local delegates more than delegates from distant towns. Gokhale and others seeming to lose their problem. Congress is tottering to its fall, and it is left for us to take it to its grave. Now there came the great error, because the two steps he took, the Indian Universities Act of 1904 and the partition of Bengal 1905, were exactly those measures which, instead of taking the Congress to the grave, totally revived the Congress. And it is from this point that we will begin tomorrow. Thank you. Any questions?
Questions can be in Hindi also, in the final answer.
ऐसा हो कि मैं जवाब दे सकूं.
How it is correct to say that the construction of national consciousness in India is basically Gramscian approach of building resistance against the hegemonic forces is in practice. How far it is correct to say it? And my second question is, could you please contextualize subaltern school of historiography, how it contests the basic assumptions of other schools of
Yes, subaltern school we will discuss in lecture 4 when we come to historiography. As far as Gramsci is concerned, actually Gramsci is describing all political movements. He is not concerned with India. In all political movements he thinks of hegemony. There is an ideology, that is a class ideology. But this hegemony is very complex. A class cannot establish its hegemony if it talks only of its own interests. If the bourgeoisie or the capitalists only talk of their own interests, why should workers and peasants follow? So first of all, you can't establish a hegemony without offering something in return. This is very clear when his subaltern classes are not the subaltern classes of subalterns. They are the intermediate classes through whom this is. Now, this is of course, Gramsci is never saying this hegemony is established deliberately, knowingly by persons. Dadabhai Nauroji didn't know I'm establishing a hegemony. He just feels for the poor and therefore records it. It is an objective phenomenon. So, Gramsci cannot be applied blindly. Nor did he mean that they should be applied. For instance, he said that the greatest ideologues of the Catholic Church are the peasants, because as peasants they join the church. Yes, anything?
Benedict Anderson wrote the Virgin Community while he was doing some field work in the island of Java and Sumatra. My question is, how far this idea of Virgin Community which he developed while doing his research work in Java and Sumatra, because these were the two main islands.
No, but he is not concerned with Java and Sumatra in his book. He is concerned more with Latin America. And here his knowledge is through English writings. They are quite considerable. So his field work has nothing to do with it. I mean, despite the picture in the title page, it has nothing to do with it. He is mainly concerned with 19th century Latin American nationalism as studied through English sources.
One last thing, sir, rather than more that all those days and all those things, one thing which I recently that in one of these speeches of writing, he is celebrating the demise of Mughal.
No, this was quite normal. This was quite normal. That he, at that time it was usual to say that the British actually have given us rule of the law and so on. He was following it. But there are other statements in which he praises the Mughal Empire. He quotes Sadi, that a king who disregards the interests of peasants will lose his throne. These kind of things. He said it in a statement, memorandum to Parliament. So like all of us, and even great men like Ram Mohan Roy made different statements on different occasions to suit it.
Sir, why does Indian history inform us very less about Netaji? Why does Indian history inform us very less about Netaji?
We will come to Subhash Bose in lecture 3. There is known as there are many biographies. Every book like Sumit Sarkar has on Subhash Bose. There are books on Indian name and so on. So it's not true.
Sir, so A.O. Hume being a retired ICS officer, what made him to mobilize Indians? Although at that time the British were unhappy with the Congress, especially of the 1888, what happened with Hume? What forced him? Was he disappointed with the British Empire?
Hume, when he was a collector, district collector in UP, he became unpopular because he mixed with Indians. See, if you were 84 years of age, you would remember that an Englishman in the 1940s did not speak Hindustani as we do. He had to say, "Hum jata hai, tum aata hai." If he didn't, but Hume unfortunately had the mode of addressing and talking with Indians, sitting down on the floor with them and so on. So at that time he was a marked man in the service. He was also an ornithologist of great eminence, bird watching. And he established schools in his district. So he had a very good record. But he didn't get promotion, and he found that his friendships with Indians was a disadvantage, so he resigned. But then he became a consistent supporter of the Indian national movement, even after his return to England. He never wavered in his support.
Lord Curzon is a man who also known as man who preserved national monuments in India. But why he got unpopular?
We will discuss that tomorrow, but because he was very unpopular, and since you have asked a question, I will get a joke about it. He writes in his letters that in the morning, Mr. Surendranath Banerjee, his moderate leader, and the Congress came to see me. And when I did what he asked me to do, some recommendation, he praised me and said he was like one of the great kings of India. It's interesting that Surendranath Banerjee picked up Ashok and Akbar as the two great kings of India and said, Curzon, you are the third one. And then in the evening he learned from his officers that Surendranath Banerjee went to a public meeting where he compared Curzon unfavorably with Genghis Khan and Tamerlane. So these were the, there were reasons why he established the archaeological survey on a better footing. He had Ancient Monuments Act was legislated in his time, but he was extremely repressive as far as Indians in general were concerned. Thank you.
Sir, can the views of moderates and extremists be categorized as leftist and rightist?
No, none of them are leftists, and certainly moderates are not.
Extremists are right.
Extremists were rightists, but not moderates. Extremists, if you take their social views, if you take their political views, they were very right.
हिंदू सोसाइटी के लिए रिफॉर्म करना चाहते हैं, सोशल रिफॉर्म करना है। सबसे ज़्यादा भगवान मुसलमानों में बोला तो वो फादर
नहीं, मुसलमानों के लिए सर सैयद ने सिर्फ सोशल रिफॉर्म में मोनोगमी को सपोर्ट किया था। मुसलमान नहीं माने तो but the social reform that he in fact specified was monogamy.